Nhớ rằng cho lên cho tớ đó là của hoa nè có trong share đã tạo tuần trí này sau YouTube nó cứ và thấy cái share hay để net cho lên cho tớ yên chỉ cho cái nó cá nhân giống và cho nó nên cho cái chân cả của đó của trong nó của gà tệ của nên sẽ là trâu hay tiền nên chẳng lắm lòng của cho đã nâng nó cho xuân hữu thế lúc nào của giờ là nhận ra đã nâng hù hay tiền lưng tiền bán tệ tao nói hay tao ó giờ thế nên chỉ tao nông tao ý này cái này nhớ là của giờ video hoặc cá cho nên tớ là còn cái lời nói của tiếp theo. The morning sun broke through the window, and the warmth cascaded across Ntxhi Laim's back. She lay on her tummy, hair a mess around her, as the ship moved about. Last night, after Ntev left her, she had been comfortable on his bed that she didn't remember when sleep took over. She pushed herself to a sitting position and lightly stretched before she swung her legs over the bed. She reached for the blanket and wrapped it around herself, walking to the small window. As she peered out, the door opened and she swung her head to find Ntev walking in, wearing a plain white t-shirt that showed what last night was hidden. The long black pants made his legs long for days as he walked in with his hair tied back in a low ponytail. Kushalala? He asked. She nodded and shoved her hair out of her face. Smiling, he replied, He smiled once before he left as she reached for the soft yellow dress hanging over the chair. Dressed, Ntxhi Laim walked out of the room to find the slave trader walking toward her with an angry glare. In the light of the day, she noticed that he sported a small, thin scar across his upper lip. He smacked his lips together, and then a grin appeared on his face. Ntxhi Laim ignored him and tried to walk past him when he reached out and grabbed her arm, yanking her back. Pain shot through her shoulder, and she let out a painful cry. He pulled her to him, and his foul breath filled her face. Cái sai tiệt, cái cho tự mình chỉ sẽ xóa tụt xin đang nhiều sợ lần đó có cộng kia là gì nó. Nhưng trong hai tiệt lần tiêu có tụt chữa mà. Cụ thể bao nhiêu đạo linh đạo đó con à? Giờ cụ chỉ tao sao để gì cụ chỉ bù lụt tao sao kia. As he stuck his tongue out to lick her, he was shoved violently forward, and Ntxhi Laim's arm felt relief as Ntev came into view. He extended a hand to her, and she took it to stand beside him. The slave trader spat on the ground and pointed a finger at him. Ntxhi mua này đã cả được cụ. Có bà bảo tiền này của tụ. Ntev smiled as he tossed a bag of coins at his feet. Xin hôn nào mù. Ntxhi Laim chỉ có tụ là. Giờ có chuyện là gì thế? Cụ yêu mua có ý cho kiểu cả tụ nông kia. Có bằng gashia. The slave trader's face darkened with fear. Tụ là con à? Giờ tụ bọc hệ xin à? Ủa giờ có chuyện tụ là tao tụ là chị. Ntev pulled out a dagger from the top of his boot, and the light hit the blade, sparkling across the man's face like a diamond in the rough. Có bà bảo, tao cũng câu ý tụ nênh. Cũng câu cả tụ vấn đề. The slave trader didn't answer. Ntev looked up and down, and then his eyes darkened. Giờ cũng câu tao hậu xế tụ à, thì có tụ kia. Có ý gì nào mà. Ta sĩ, giờ cũng câu tao có sát tá tụ à, lý cho lý ý tụ cá lý à. Có sao bà yêu sư rủ, thì họ có tụ vì có tuần trả chỉ tụ. Xua tụ tí nên cũng câu tụ à. Giờ nếu sợ tao là biết đã nên kể ní hai đứa có hai thì có chính pha có cho lũ. Vì để ta xin nó có dễ họ cũng mua con câu có sát tá tụ. The slave trader swallowed hard and lowered to the ground. Có yếu có mua mà, quý xin chờ. He got up and left as Ntev turned to her. He brushed her hair back gently and took her hand, leading her up the stairs. As they made it to the main deck, the men on board all turned their eyes toward her with a hunger that frightened her. She cowered behind Ntev as he led her to the back corner of the ship, where a table was set up. She took a seat as he sat across from her. The same male servant from last night brought them food, and then left them. The men were still looking in her direction, and she turned to Ntxhi. She asked. He picked up a nut and tossed it into his mouth. He leaned forward. Ntxhi lowered her face. Oh, she shot her eyes up. Nà mò thổ có mua có tụ kinh tế cũ có chừng mà cổ cậu nên. Giới thứ bữa nhẹ thứ bố chỉ đang lúc sinh tiền lỡ, nên chính trai bộ đi co. She blushed. Cú sa chỉ sao để cái nhận tao cũ đi co. Chỉ sao sao mua. Mua anh nuôi tư có thể cũ trốn trốn, chỉ có những bảo để ở trong nhóm bảo tư. She frowned with confusion. Chúa, chúa, chúa sẽ tao trong nhóm thế đó. Ôi cha họ tao trong nhóm tao nọ. Ntxhi laughed and crossed his arms. Wow, đùa tay à, lòng câu. Cơ mà ban đầu thì tia, cơ mà thế đi chỉ nhờ giờ ý tiêu lòng câu thì tia liền. Cái liền, cái chỉ là nó mở trái về thì cũng hơi chắc là lờ. Ntxhi unrolled the map on the table and set 4 candlestick holders to prevent it from moving. His captain, Kitao, entered the room, moving the hat that covered his dark hair. The man was tall and had a frightening set of dark eyes that seemed to bear hate. But honestly, the man was as soft as pudding. Yala, chushin de lesu, the atsacha. Gasalika. Lupo yata what's it swally naked with tao chache? Kitao asked. Yet what she tao gay. Jakunto. Louis to son the gupanche hadia. What tai rako? Little tao tutsi, mujato ikatuta, what's a tsuheng. Batu Tonama, Jotiete Tonan, get to enjoy Katua, Kitchity. Yakuhai got what I more ear to the Gusike Gulu Hapia Queen or Toyongi. Get out ladder deep breath. Kapoyan Chunta at the Hota Yamoto Gama. Loyana Yochu, Ntxhi Laim more than the young Yiroko. Guchisa. Nia going more. Ya no Zade Gubusa. Kala Guyachumuntekata Gutsiluke. That was the reason for his 7 years at sea. His father had left on a ship 10 years ago to set sail to a land of adventure to find gold. He hadn't ever returned. 3 years after his father went missing, Ntxhi set sail without success. He was now returning home to request mercenaries from the king. He was positive his father was not dead. Ntxhi rolled the map back up and hid it in the same drawer. Mona come back at gets in a year cock. Tolung gone day in a game to Molan zero bay, Ntxhi said. Oli. Ntxhi walked out and was making his way toward his room when the sound of a muffled gasp stopped him. It was coming from the room of the slave trader. He turned his feet toward the door, reached for the knob, and turned. Ntxhi Laim was tied to a pole with a gag in her mouth as the slave trader was sharpening a knife beside her. Anger filled him as the slave trader lunged at him with the knife. The impact hit him in the shoulder as the blade entered his flesh. Ntxhi Laim's muffled scream filled his ears as he removed the knife with a quick motion, and with an upright curve move of his arm, he stabbed the slave trader in the rib. The sound of the blood gurgling out between the blades of his bone was loud. Cô tôi kinh tổng nó có ta là, để sử dụng cái đèn tôi là sao nó, rồi nó có yếu bảo hai tia, có sao bài yếu sử dụng chỉ tu, yếu mò con bảo lý tu. Ntxhi said as he withdrew the knife, and the slave trader fell to his knees. He cut the ropes holding Ntxhi Laim and carried her over his shoulder out. He walked to his room where he set her down to the ground and removed her gag. She immediately went to inspect his wound. Gabolika, she asked with fear in her voice. Shaking his head, he replied, Guchoya. La, yekupako. She pulled a chair and helped him to sit down. She reached for his buttons, but stopped, and then reached again. He saw her cheeks blush, and with one instant, he reached for the collar and ripped the shirt off her. Her eyes widened at his motion as he relaxed his shoulders and waited for her. Oja, katu tega mabakunane. She thought sinang dola. She opened her mouth to speak but clamped it again. Totsi. Dawnyaho luto. He pointed to the dresser and she walked to open it, removing some towels and some antibiotics. She grabbed a large basin and left to return later with some water. She set it down and began to clean his wound. Kai kusha. Oja ko hanyaho nushate. Taeyang asked as she washed his shoulder. She lowered her gaze. Tiya, ni da ko idea ni mo ka kong. Nyata ni ru chapu. Ko kumunga. Taeyang looked at her with disappointment. E kon chung ni yong ni bokola. She looked at him with sad eyes. Ya kong nu haida. Ya kutsin tetu. Utelimu. Kutatao. He said as he watched her. Ko boja. Kushi olika. Dashi uchokalanga. Chili deja kutuchirong yola. As her hand reached up to apply the medicine to his wound, he caught her wrists and pulled her closer to him. Her eyes held a fear that he hadn't seen before in a woman, but most women he knew never had experienced what she did. He just wanted to take care of her so she'd never feel pain again. He closed the distance between them and kissed her gently. The feel of her lips against his made a fire within him that exploded, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, bringing her in closer to sit on his lap. She bravely put her hands on his arms, and as she opened herself up to him, a violent jolt shoved both of them to the floor. Something was happening on deck. Taeyang helped her stand, and then he threw on a tunic. Nyati dara. Sotala, he cried as he ran out of the room. Another jolt sent him flying across the hallway, and his shoulders slammed into the jagged wall, opening his wound from before. He struggled to get up as Kitao met him halfway. The man's head was bleeding from an injury. Yo Ulika, Taeyang yelled. Taeyang finally stood and ran up the deck where a huge black ship was a few feet away with cannons pointing toward them. He saw one pulling back, getting ready to fire. Kia! He shouted. Kia tashino! He shoved as many people as he could down as the cannon fired, and the impact sent him flying across the deck where his head hit the boards on the railing. His vision blurred, and pain escalated throughout his body. He couldn't move as he saw the other ship gain access to his. Then a group of men dressed all in black leather jumped onto deck, and two picked him up by the arms, dragging him toward the front where a tall man with shoulder-length black hair stood. He wore a red tribal print vest over his sun-kissed body that held muscular arms and a chest that was taut with strength. He had a mustache that made him look uninviting to kindness. Yola, one of the men by his arm said. The man noticed him and walked to inspect him up and down. His voice was deep, almost like a cold whisper as he spoke. Taeyang noticed that all the men were armed with swords. Taeyang asked. The man smiled. Chỉ nâng nhờ ý ảnh gạo lý có thế cũ, quyến xin trai liao. Giờ có một bằng sự tia, lo ưu xin cho rõ, Taeyang said. The man smiled and gestured for his two men to let him go. They dropped him to the ground where he fell with a thud. Tao cơ. Giờ có dân, cụ mà ti rong trạc á. Giờ có sứ, cụ sa tao giả tư, cụ giờ khờ giả tờ. Trusting that Ntxhi Laim would stay in a room and be unseen, Taeyang stood up and smiled. Tao cơ. His men began to shout for room, and as the space around them widened, Taeyang made his way to the middle, meeting him. He threw the first punch, and it landed across the man's cheek. His head turned sideways, but he didn't even flinch. Taeyang's eyes widened from fear as he realized this man was a lot stronger than he thought. He threw a second punch, and the same reaction came. The man looked at him and then smiled. Go, Saolala. Before Taeyang could answer, he missed seeing the right hook from him. When the impact hit him, he felt as if his teeth all became loose, and the tissues from inside his mouth tore. He felt his flesh break as he fell to the knees in a crumbling loss. He tasted blood, and a mouthful of red liquid came dripping out. Pain shot through his left cheek as he slowly looked up at the man who came to block the sun from his view. The second punch put him on his back, unable to breathe. When he raised his hand the third time, the sound of Ntxhi Laim's voice caused Ntev to feel fear in his heart. Chukia! She cried as she came running up to deck. The man turned, and as she neared, he reached for her arm and pulled her toward him. Ntxhi Laim! Ntev cried as he felt his body give out under him. Ju! Ntev! She cried as tears streamed down her face. The man smiled, and he violently pulled her back into his arms, his hand caressing her back. The pain from her wounds caused her to fight him, and he turned her around, tearing her gown. The action made her cover herself up quickly, and the men around them laughed. The man's eyes widened at the horrific wounds on her back, and he turned to Ntev. "Ta oli garonu," Ntev said with a mouthful of blood. "Ta oli garonu. Gushaya nyaka tumoronu titala sha. Godunu gajitsi yakia. Daya!" He motioned with his hand, and his men came to grab Ntev to a standing position. He took off his vest and put it around Ntxhi Laim's shoulders. "Yagadalu, gashula, yakusatao, kujonakumu." Ntev saw her shocked look, and as she tried to run to him, the man simply hoisted her on his shoulder and carried her away. He fought the men holding him, but they jammed their sword handles into his head, sending him into a blackened state. 我就那时候了共同二人的让人冷等班的，当中冷冻杯有的是晒的那那么，他跟那时候人机子给那干那种杯嘛，你先知道。